Hello, San Diego Comic-Con at Home 2020. Welcome to Wakanda Forever, the psychology of Black Panther. I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, cognitive psychologist from Illinois State University. Joining me on today's panel is an amazing group of Black Panther experts. I'm so glad you're all here. Our first panelist is geek therapist Dr. Vanessa Hintz, a fan of all things Marvel, Black Panther, experienced panelist, and of course, all things horror. Dr. Hintz, what is the most profound influence Black Panther has had on your life?
I guess for me, Black Panther was just so unapologetically Black that I in my lifetime as a millennial, had not seen a movie on the level of the MCU that was so in your face with Black culture that it literally brought me to tears. The waterfall scene, every time, the first ritual scene brings me to tears. And so for me, it was just visually, aesthetically stunning. There were some very fine men that they cast for the film, so I appreciated that as well. They were often shirtless. I appreciated that very much. But in addition to that, they showcased the strength, the versatility of Black women, and I, as a Black woman, just very appreciated that.
Fantastic. Our next panelist is Mr. Victor Dandridge Jr., founder of Vantage Inhouse Productions, author of The Kindergardians, Origins Unknown, The Samaritan, The Trouble with Love, and the creator of You Create Comics, a K-12 curriculum that helps young people develop their creative skills. Victor, what is the most profound influence Black Panther has had on your life?
This is an interesting question because I think it's an evolving question. As we, exist in the aftermath that is Black Panther, it kind of changes. And I think right now I have a different idea of the impact of it from my sons. It made me look at being a father and looking at the situation that Killmonger grew up in and doing what I can to make sure that my sons don't have to experience that. So now that they're a little bit older, they're both teenagers now, it's really hitting harder of what kind of world that Black Panther showed us could be.
Oh, that's fantastic. Our next panelist is Mr. Daniel Jun Kim, social justice warrior supreme, Spider-Man fan in all the right mentoring ways, and perhaps the coolest social activist ever. Daniel, please tell us, what's the most profound impact Black Panther's had on your life?
So there are actually a lot of reasons I love the Black Panther so much, and some of them have to do with race. But what I'll share today is that T'Challa for me represents someone who's extremely intelligent and rational on one hand, but at the same time is also profoundly spiritual. Because in our culture, I think there's this widespread notion that science and spirituality conflict with each other. And I think this bias is kind of reflected in comics where you have a lot of these highly intelligent characters who are often atheists, which is totally fine, right? There's nothing wrong in itself with that, except for the fact that it kind of tends to perpetuate this bias. And T'Challa specifically, but also just many people in Wakanda in general, show in their actions that there's no fundamental conflict between science and spirituality, or at least it doesn't have to be. Because, did you hear a weird sound? I thought I heard some weird whistling sound.
I did.
I think we have pirates aboard.
No, that was agreement right there. That's what that was.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that was you. There's no fundamental conflict between science and spirituality, or there doesn't have to be, because I do realize that sometimes people might act in ways that make it seem like there's a conflict, but that's on them. That's their approach to the limited approach. It doesn't have to be a conflict. So that's one reason, as someone who is kind of spiritual and like science also, I love seeing that reflected in this character.
I think Einstein's in your court on that one as well, right? He has a famous quote about the relationship between science and religion. Our next panelist is Comic-Con International Inkpot Award winner, Mr. Alex Simmons. Alex is also the author of Blackjack, Archie and Friends, and Scooby-Doo. He's also the founder of Kids Comic-Con International. Alex, what is the most profound impact Black Panther has had on your life?
How much time do we have? I'll try and like bring this into a little nutshell here. When you say that it's not just the movie, for me, I was around when the original comic book series came out. And so to me, seeing a Black costume character who was prominent at that time, even though he was guest appearing in a lot of issues, that was amazing. And it was a big push because that was the time of Spider-Man and some of these other things had already been there. But here came this character. So that was exciting. And that sort of coasted until McGregor got to it and gave it a year-long run, which is the same storyline, the 12-issue storyline that the movie was based on. So once again, seeing and being a part of watching Wakanda development, that was suddenly Camelot. It was a Black Camelot. Now we had Africans and Black people living in a world that had majesty about it. And that was fantastic. The fact that it was a scientific wonder pulled into my science fiction mind, but it also pulled into a lot of my peers who were either into superheroes or science fiction. And suddenly now there's all that in Africa, blew their minds. So that was also a big pump. And then I'll just do a quick reference. There's a movie with Will Smith called The Pursuit of Happiness, where you see a Black father struggling to be there for his son through these extremely difficult times. And that's a heroic image. I don't mean like superpowered. That's a human heroic image of a Black person trying to take care of his child. And so then to see in Black Panther this storyline again of father the son, son to fail, father the failing son, if you want to put it that way, and then the whole ramifications of not taking care of your children until there's this point where they are warring against each other was intense. And then of course, again, against the tapestry of the film and the drama, you had a balance of not only the men who were looking powerful and all that, but the women step forward as diplomats, as warriors, as scientists. So to me, it was like this huge gaping space time warp just opened up, and suddenly the world was richer for this huge experience that took 40 some odd years to happen.
Fantastic.
Yes, yes.
Our next panelist is Dr. Stanford Carpenter, cultural anthropologist, comic scholar, comic artist, and former archaeologist. Dr. Carpenter is also the co-creator of the forthcoming NPR affiliate podcast titled Brother Story and The Correspondent, an ethnographic and journalistic take on comics, culture, and the lives of the people who create and consume them. Stanford, what's the most profound impact Black Panther's had on your life?
For me, it was how it brought together, both big and small, right? I mean, like a lot of people, I saw Black Panther with my daughter, and I remember going to it, and she was obviously much younger. She was in grade school at the time, and even just the lead up, like I remember her seeing the seeing the commercials for it and being like asking, are we gonna see a Black hero? Are we gonna see him actually fight white villains? And she was asking, she was curious about those questions. And so I had the opportunity to actually see it on opening night and then a couple days later with her. And it was just amazing to kind of see it through her eyes, right? And thinking to myself, what would it have been like for me to see it at her age, right? But at the same time, reconciling what that meant for me at my age, right? And at my age, it's like so on one hand, I'm seeing this moment for my daughter, on the other hand, I'm seeing this incredible moment of cultural reappropriation. That's the best way I could describe it. If you look, if you really think about the history of Black Panther, you've got a character that was created by two Jewish white guys, and they made him and they did a good job with him. And then you see how the character's been shepherded, developed from with artists from all different walks of life and writers from all different walks of life. But ultimately he was coming through a mainstream cultural producer first as Marvel Comics, through Marvel Comics, and then and then Disney purchases Marvel, and then they produce the movie, right? So it is very much you know, something that's being pumped into like the mainstream of culture. So it was amazing just to see him be adopted, you know, by these mainstream, you know, cultural institutions. But then there's this other moment where when it came out, all of a sudden we saw just a mass expression of Black buying power. I mean, seeing all of these African American and Black people throughout the diaspora just lining up, showing up in cosplay. And it was like this moment where it was like where I felt like whoever created Black Panther, it was clear who was taking the character back in that moment. That was one of the things I really appreciated. I appreciated that somehow this character managed to fill all of those spots. He didn't become he didn't lose his existence in the mainstream as he was being sort of reappropriated by African Americans, right? You know, I mean, I think at San Diego Comic-Con, when with the whole Black Heroes Matters flash mob, right? And, you know, everyone's getting ready, lined up for the picture a couple years ago. And it was right after the Black Panther movie came out. Everyone decided they're going to do the Wakanda Forever salute, right? And, you know, and I believe it was Hannibal Taboo yelling in the background, you know, as people are doing it's like, wait a second, everybody, right over left, don't be a jerk, right? You know, making sure everyone did it right in that moment for the picture. I mean, it's like, and like I said, it's this combination of these sort of big grand and these little things, and all coming together around this movie, and to see it be done, you know, in a way that puts the way we imagine Black culture center stage was amazing.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Stanford. Our next panelist is Dr. Eric Wesselmann, frequent contributor to Sterling's Popular Culture Psychology series, member of the WGLT Psych Geeks podcast team, all-around con fan who bears a striking resemblance to Bobby from Supernatural, and of course, brother preacher man, spreading the gospel about all things pop culture at cons big and small, near and far. Eric, what's the most profound impact Black Panther's had on your life?
Well, there are two that I would like to point out. The first is that it's the film and then the film and the comics, as well as the larger cultural conversation around this universe, has inspired me to take my research on social inclusion and exclusion in a new direction, which we'll talk about a little later in the panel. The other is just that this material has provided me with multiple opportunities to hang out with you all and just have wonderful conversations. And every time we do this, we think of new directions. So that's just been very, very fulfilling, and I enjoy it immensely.
Wakanda Forever. The most profound impact that Black Panther's had on me, I have to echo Victor in that it changes. I gave an answer 3 months ago. I gave an answer a year ago. One of the things I love about the Black Panther phenomenon is where it's taken my research. I believe our culture has been living in the illusion of separateness since its founding. Trying to understand the Black Panther media, the comic books, the movie, and contributing to a book on it, I found myself reading things where I discovered that, for example, 80% of the world's population lives in collectivist cultures. And only 20% of the world's population lives in individualist cultures, and that's the United States and Europe, right? So the idea that we have the American individualist mind basically sort of buried in this ethos of individualism, I think that's part of the power of what Black Panther brought to the American public. I mean, we see everything's about everything in movies all the time, but it's usually on a small scale, and everybody's only coming together when there's a huge invasion from outer space. Whereas in Black Panther, you had the micro and the macro constantly coming together, going apart. But in the end, as I've heard Victor say before, when things hit the fan, we come together. I just like that, what I would call that wholeness, that lack of separateness vibe about what a culture is and our place in the world. And it's really gave voice to that. And I'm just delighted to be able to talk about it with you guys. And Wakanda Forever. So why Black Panther? Well, in addition to this fantastic movie we've been discussing, some of us had the opportunity to contribute to this amazing book, Black Panther Psychology, Hidden Kingdoms. The book was co-edited by Dr. Travis Langley and our own Alex Simmons, and is part of Sterling's popular culture psychology series. And so we're going to start a sort of individual question section here. We're going to start off with Vanessa. So Vanessa, in that book, you contributed a chapter called Stages of Minority Identity Development, a juxtaposition of T'Challa and Eric Killmonger. Can you tell us what went on in that?
Yes, definitely. So just very briefly, a quick overview. So what I wrote about in the chapter was in psychology, there's a minority identity development model that was developed by Dr. Sue and others that basically goes through initially minority individuals, in this case, Black individuals, sort of disavow their minority culture and are, I guess, entrenched in majority culture, which in our case would be white culture. Something happens that sort of thrusts them into this stage of dissonance where it's like, I'm not sure, this is not me, this doesn't vibe. Usually this is some sort of race-related event. In the case of, excuse me, Killmonger, we can argue that it was the death of his father. After that, they move into this sort of resistance and immersion stage where they completely reject the majority culture and are fully immersed in their minority culture, which in this case would be Wakandan culture, African-American culture for Killmonger. And the way the model is written, which is rooted in white ethnocentric values, is that's not a good place to be, and we should be moving towards integration. So the way I wrote about it in the chapter was related to the way sort of T'Challa got to that integrative stage through a whole, slew of things. But we see Killmonger sort of firmly cemented in that angry Black man stage, that resistance and immersion stage. And I talk a little bit about why that is. And I think something I just want to expound upon a little bit here in this conversation is, for Killmonger, what may have fueled his sort of rage, if you will, is the experience of like chronic racism growing up in America, because as we know, unlike Wakanda, which is a sovereign African nation, very peaceful, we have America, which is none of those things, which is sort of was founded on this sort of idea of separatism, like you talked about, white supremacy and different things of that nature. So there's a lot of psychological research that talks about the impact of chronic race-based trauma and why it is different than other forms of trauma. And one sort of difference is that we've sort of moved from overt forms of racism, so like the Klan, different things of that nature, to more covert or aversive forms of racism, like in the form of microaggressions. So for microaggressions, just as a, random aside, or sort of like daily communications that intentionally or otherwise communicate some sort of derogatory or less thanness of members of a marginalized culture. So for me, one that I get often, even though I have a whole ass doctorate degree, is you're very articulate.
Ooh.
You're very
smart. Ooh. I know that one.
So arguably, Killmonger growing up as a young Black boy in America would have experienced this from birth until forever. So the sort of in psychology, the argument is that over time, those microaggressions start to add up and they turn into what we call race-based stress, which over time turns into racial trauma. And trauma, race-based or otherwise, affects us psychologically. It changes our DNA. It affects us biologically. So arguably, in addition to sort of what I talked about in the chapter, Killmonger and his rage and his revenge and all of those things, all of his villainness, was rooted and cultivated by racism and what he experienced growing up as a sort of a Black boy in America. And so I think that is ever so salient, given what is going on right now, because I think something that is also insidious, if you will, about race-based trauma is that it's sort of, there's a socio-historical context and it is just constant. So when psychologically, therapeutically, we're treating people who have experienced race-based trauma, we don't sort of get them to a place where they get over it. We teach them how to cope with it. Right. So arguably for Killmonger, he never got those lessons, or he chose to cope with it in a way that wasn't necessarily adaptive. So I think that in juxtaposing or comparing T'Challa's character to Killmonger, I think understanding the impact of racism for an African growing up in Africa and an African growing up in America is very important.
Anyone want to respond to that?
First things first, I think we need to pass around the collection plate because that was some church.
My wallet up.
Okay, you know what I'm saying? She preached on that one.
Yes.
But no, I think that's a brilliant thing to understand, that those experiences are relevant more so today, like literally this morning, than we probably have ever recognized as a people.
Fantastic. Anyone else, real quick?
I'm not.
Yes, Vanessa. Eric, come on.
She was perfect, and Victor's reaction was perfect. I mean, there's just, yeah.
All right.
The thing of it is, I just think is it's great that you said it. It's great that it was put out there so it can be heard. That's all I would say to that.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to move on to Victor then. Was Marvel Disney prepared to deal with the success of Black Panther?
No, they were not. Let's be frank here. The more interesting perspective here is not just the greatness that Black Panther was as a movie, it is the reaction of people, businesses, structures to it. And when you look at the monetary value of what Black Panther brought to the table, $700 million plus domestically, $1.3 billion worldwide, there's something to be said about what Black Panther brought to the table. But the truth is, Marvel nor Disney were actually prepared for it. Despite the fact that Black Panther first premiered in 2016's Captain America Civil War, there was only a limited supply of content that could feed multiple readerships post Black Panther. And I think that was one of the biggest mistakes. In talking to a local comic shop, shout out to Comic Town, where I filmed Black, White, and Red all over. We had this discussion of how there were children so inspired off of Black Panther, first-time readers, young Black kids that are coming into comic shops for the first time, and with no disrespect, the only current iteration of the character that they had to read was Ta-Nehisi Coates. That's way above what their entrance level should have been. There's a huge lack. It wasn't until, was it December 2019 that the Marvel action series for Black Panther came out. We're talking nearly 2 years after the movie release, something that's a little bit more kid-friendly by design, by showcase, that actually feeds into the readership that should have been developed from this movie. We saw on a multicultural level that everyone appreciated what Black Panther was. You had young white kids running around in Black Panther costumes. So this should have been capitalized on from the onset, from after Civil War, but wasn't. And you can really get the sense that they didn't really know what they had, because if you actually take Black Panther out of the equation of the road to Infinity War, you actually can tell that story and it doesn't miss a beat. The only thing that we absolutely know from Black Panther is that Bucky is in Wakanda. But look at how that wasn't played out in the actual Black Panther movie. Why was Bucky not a part of the fight against Killmonger? Why was he absent? That's weird. Your whole, ability to exist literally, as opposed to being held as a criminal for your crimes or anything like that, is all based on who is in control of Wakanda. So that should have been absolutely somebody that they went to go get. Black Panther was by design a standalone movie. It was never meant to actually fit within the greater scope of what the Avengers series was. It just is, it's an unfortunate truth, but it's an absolute truth when you look at it from a narrative standpoint. Even if you go to the point of saying, watching towards the end of Black Panther and the fact that T'Challa opened up the borders to the rest of the world, but in Infinity War, when they go to Wakanda, the dome is still up. Why is that? If he's already opened up everything, why is that still the case? And it's just indicative of the fact that they didn't realize what was what was happening. They didn't realize how popular, how perfect this particular movie was going to be and how it would resonate with so many people. And you can see that by the way that they didn't have things in place to truly capitalize on it. How long did it take for us to get a baby Groot toy, figure, pop doll, any of that after Guardians 2? Didn't take long at all. But when it comes to kid-friendly content, things that are accessible, aside from costumes, it took almost 2 years in order for them to develop that. That's a misstep. You know, that's a clear indicator that, you know, what happened with Black Panther, they didn't realize was going to be so perfect, so right. And the question therein becomes, what lessons did they learn from that? You know, is it possible that they looked at it and said, ooh, not that we needed to see heroes that look like us, that, you know, operated in a racial sense that was more inclusive but very specific. They might have looked at it and said, oh, people like movies with cats in them. And what did we get last year? That's all I'm gonna say. I'm gonna just, you know, leave it at that. But, you know, that's I think that's the thing, is they really were not prepared for the success of Black Panther.
Alex, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I want, again, eloquent, my brother. Eloquent.
Thank you.
Passionate, as only a father could be. You know?
100%.
I just want to add to that, because I do a lot of work, as you know, with children and young people and everything. And except for mainstream publishing, children's books, who quickly grabbed some illustrators and threw together some quick stories and popped them on the shelf. You're right. There was diddly, you know. Someone asked me, because I did a couple of speaking engagements around that same time period, just before the movie came out and then soon after. And I remember at one speaking engagement, someone said something about, did you think that Disney and Marvel really wanted to help Black people by doing the Black Panther movie? And I said, I'm going to tell you right now, I doubt they went, you know, we need to do a socially relevant film, so let's do this for the millions of dollars that it's going to cost. I said, they did it because it was a recognizable character. You're right, it does stand alone. I think that some of the magic of it, and I'm sure I'm going to get some pushback somewhere from somebody, but I'll just duck. Some of the magic of it was because probably they didn't expect a whole lot to come from it. It had almost free reign. B, the folks on it were closer to the culture and had major skin in the game. We are bringing our A game here.
Yes.
And because Disney said, well, here's some money, they went, we're going to spend this sucker right. And pulled in all the right people. I mean, you could see the thinking behind it, but you could also see all that creativity coming to it, because everyone had skin in the game. And the children, white, Black, and otherwise, because whether people want to remember this or not, we are all human beings, period. Okay? Culture, you know, that's one thing. Race, that's a concept. But the bottom line, the children saw a hero. That's what they saw.
That's where the organ's coming back in. Keep going.
They saw somebody get knocked down and come back. They saw him going up against something that was far more dangerous than he was. And they said, bring it. They saw his family and people supporting him, and kids lost their minds. And that's what's supposed to happen.
Can I just follow up?
You know, all of that, the corporations didn't get it, but everybody else did.
It's also kind of what you just said. It also expresses in the fact that they rolled out individual characters and individual movies, and then actually had the name of the movie Avengers Assemble, right? Where when you watch the movie Black Panther, you're in his whole life. It's not so much about an individual as it is a culture, and it just speaks volumes. And you wonder to what extent, I suspect the writers were aware of that, but the people that were in charge of the money, I don't know that they recognized this, what Daniel will talk about, holism versus individualism kind of tension that was expressed across those movies. That's fantastic. So Daniel, how does Black Panther speak to the need for group ritual and holism?
First, I want to apologize in advance if you hear a barking dog. Okay, bear with me. Is in the background. Yeah. So what I want to say about holism and group rituals, which I'll get to in a second, actually relates to the things that some other panelists are talking about, but from a different angle. Now, obviously, we have a lot going on right now. Right. On one hand, there's a global pandemic. And we also have the latest manifestations of ongoing systemic racism and racial injustice. Now, together, these social crises are creating a super stressful backdrop against which some individuals, including myself at the moment, might be going through personal crises as well, on top of all that. So it just makes everything kind of all the more overwhelming. Now, unfortunately, we in the modern Western world don't have a certain built-in resource that people from certain pre-industrial societies or modern societies that have been able to hold on to aspects of their traditions, something that they have. And that resource is called a crisis ritual, which is a subset of group rituals. We do in the modern West have what you might call rituals, right? But it's different. And we certainly don't have anything when we're going through crises, either individually or as a society. We don't have a kind of crisis ritual that resembles something like, say, the Sundance, which certain indigenous American tribes practice during times of crisis. Now, the reason we don't have, in my belief, the reason we don't have anything like that is because something like the Sundance emerges out of a holist viewpoint, right? A holist view of reality, in which the individual and the society can't be viewed in isolation from each other. Likewise, the mind and the body can't be separated from a holist viewpoint, right? All of these things, the individual, the self, the mind, the body, are all interlinked in a holistic system that you can't look at in isolation the way we tend to do in the West. So in the context of a holist worldview, what a crisis ritual does basically, in a nutshell, is that it helps people to realize that they never go through a crisis alone, because the community has your back, your group, your society has your back. Not just symbolically, but they actually have your back. And the ritual ensures that you not just realize this logically, but you feel it in your bones. And there are certain mechanisms, such as something called synchrony, by which group rituals do this, but I don't have time to get into that level of detail because I only have 5 minutes. But so you feel it in your bones through a group ritual that your society has your back. And in return, you have to have your society's back as well, but you're happy to do so because you understand that the health and well-being of yourself and your society are interlinked, right? You don't see it in isolation the way we do here in the US, for example. So, you know, when we have a massive social crises rather, like we have now, we have people here in this country that feel like it doesn't affect them, right? They don't feel compelled to take action because it doesn't affect them, even though it actually does. So what crisis rituals and group rituals do in whole societies, it helps it helps individuals understand just how interlinked these components are, and that they're part of a system. You can't look at them in isolation. So what does this have to do with, like, the Black Panther? Well, if you read the comics closely, and if you watch the film closely, Wakanda emerges as a kind of vision of in my opinion, a obviously fictional but feasible vision of a highly advanced and technological society that's very science-based, advanced as any society could be, but has maintained a grasp on aspects of its tradition, such as its holist viewpoint and its group rituals and its crisis rituals, which helps the members of that society, not least of all T'Challa himself, understand their interlinked connection with everyone else, right? And I believe that we here in the US could learn from that, frankly. And that's my 5 minutes.
Oh, fantastic.
That's very well said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. If I could follow up on that, I like this idea of the word you use, knowing that the group has your back. And I would argue that level of knowing is an experience that comes from lived life, and it's unconscious. So when we hit a space that's a crisis, our unconscious assumptions are, what the hell am I going to do, right? Whereas in a holist culture where people have taken care of you, you've taken care of them, that's not your first assumption, right? You experience the moment differently because of these unconscious these unconscious assumptions you developed over your life that form a background for any moment of experience. And those kind of cultures definitely do that for people.
If I can jump in on that one. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that the simple aspect, the easiest way to break that down for those of us that are more Western minded and can't hear, it is the difference between using they versus we.
Yeah.
And I think that's phenomenal. Like as the book show, as the movie shows, Wakanda functions more so on the we aspect than any part of the they aspect. And that's so very important, because once you separate, you know, I from they, it is an other, and therefore not relevant to me, not, you know, I'm not conscious of it. I had a lot of people over the last few weeks have conversations about their place in systemic indoctrination and their ideas of saying, well, I've never seen this happen. I've never seen or taken part in this systemic indoctrination. And, you know, my comeback to it is always, have you ever seen $1 million? And they go, no. And I said, do you know anyone who has $1 million? And they say, no. I said, but you believe $1 million exists, right? And they go, yes. And it's interesting how we can all have the we factor on something like $1 million that many of us have never seen, but something as common as interactions that are, you know, more biased or judicious towards a group of people, you can't seem to understand that. That's very interesting to me, and it seemed to open up a lot of minds. I appreciate that.
We're going to go on to a question for Alex.
Okay.
Who has the right to create or write ethnic and multicultural heroes?
Who has or who takes? Yeah.
Well, it's your question.
Oh, shots fired. I was sipping. You almost made me choke. I wasn't.
Yeah. Okay. Again, one of those questions, and I've answered this one before in various places. So if there's pushback, there's pushback. I think any creative individual has the right to tell stories, to tell good stories. I think where race or gender or sometimes even politics comes in is if you're going to tell a story about a people, a culture, a race, or a gender that you are not a part of, that you better do your homework. Do your due diligence. If you have any kind of ethical code, if you care about the quality of what you do and your name as a creative, then if I don't know something, I better do my homework. But I think that the history that we've dealt with, and this gets into a situation that came up, the history we've dealt with, the life that we've dealt with, and so many of you have eloquently talked about the systemic aspect of racism, is for years, decades, hundreds of years, but most certainly since the early 1900s, there have been white writers writing about Black people or Chinese or Japanese. And especially if you talk about the comic book world or fantasy, you got Burroughs with Tarzan. And then as you move forward into the 20s and 30s, you have various other characters popping up, and any Black characters are usually big-lipped and, you know, don't have decent speech or can't articulate, or they're step and fetch it, or so it's a negative image. When we went into World War II, I won't talk about one, but World War II, when the Chinese were our allies, we had Chinese allies in the comics who had Bugs Bunny teeth. And, you know, even the Blackhawks, you have most of the Blackhawks in these cool outfits with the aviators caps and the 45s, and you've got the Chinese cook, Chop Chop, running around with a couple of meat cleavers. But yet they're fighting the enemy. He's on our side, but look at the representation. So when you follow that trail of misrepresentation, insultive representation, stereotypical representation, all the way into the 60s and 70s, then the pushback naturally is going to be, whoa, wait a minute. We need to be writing about our own, back up. Okay, so you get a certain amount of pushback. That makes sense too. And you have Black writers and Chinese and Japanese writers, and Native American writers and Hispanic writers writing their characters. You move into the 80s, you start getting this. And then for me in the comic book world, money talked. And it became what's selling. And suddenly a lot of those representations, even coming from our own, were what I would deem, note I say me, negative representation. Because then it was a lot of what can we kill, how fast, we're badass, we're getting laid, we're doing all these things that were considered cool for the screen or cool for what was a cool image. If you were Chinese, you definitely had to be a martial artist. That was it. Couldn't be a school teacher, you know? You couldn't be a caseworker. You couldn't be, well, maybe one or two of them were scientists. They got that in there. But bottom line, you were expected to be X because we're writing it. So for me, I think that the pushback was necessary to get people of color, to get more women into the industry, writing and representing their own. And then there, for me, again, my opinion, we have to share the territory. Because I know, speaking personally, although I could speak about some others, but speaking personally, I worked very hard at becoming the writer and the performer and the speaker that I've become. And I tried to do my due diligence over all these years, which means I feel that if I'm going to write a story about people that are not like me, I will do my homework, and I have the right to do that as long as I bring my A game. But if I say as a Black person, no white person should be writing Black people, then that means I shouldn't be writing white people. That means I also shouldn't be writing about women. It means I also shouldn't be writing about a cartoon dog, because I've never been that either. You know? So ultimately, which way is the pendulum swinging? Swing towards quality and equality. And I think that's necessary for all sides to win in this. Don't get in my way of representing me or us correctly, and I won't get in your way of doing the same.
Well said.
Well said. Yeah.
Let's go ahead and follow that up with Eric's question, because it's very much related. Eric, how does Black Panther draw our attention to the relationship between media and social exclusion or inclusion?
So, you know, I'm a social psychologist, and most of my interests are in the ways that we connect with others, and what happens when we feel devalued, marginalized, or ignored in some cases. And most of my work has been on interpersonal relationships. But what struck me as I was looking at sort of the cultural discussion around Black Panther, director and writer Ryan Coogler's introduction to the film, for example, and then also resonated with several of the comments that you all have made, is that having someone a main character you can identify with, someone that looks like you or comes from the same backgrounds, is very important for connecting, not just in that narrative, but also in building the schemas of what you can be, what people like you can be, the possibilities. And so when there is negative representation, that certainly has negative impacts on the individual's self-esteem. That's well established in the literature. But I'm really interested in when one doesn't see someone that they connect with from their background, how does that make them feel? And then some of the data that I had been collecting, you know, certain participants have talked about the context of superheroes, right? If there's not a superhero who shares aspects of their identity, they feel invisible. They don't have role models. And I've become particularly sensitive to that in the context just gender. So I've both boys and girls at home, and as a cisgender heterosexual white male, I've always been represented. Right, I've sort of just taken that for granted. That's part of my privilege. But as I've watched my children experience narratives and characters who look like them or don't, it's kind of like what Stanford said earlier about experiencing the film through your eyes and then your daughter's eyes. You know, I've seen my daughters, for example, recognize when there aren't, you know, women or young girl characters in these narratives. I mean, I remember one time, I think my son talked about Wonder Woman and said, well, she's a hero. And my younger daughter at the time, who was probably only 3, said, well, she can't be a hero. She's a girl. And I was like, my head exploded. And I was like, who told you that? Whose parent do I have to call? But it was probably not necessarily something they heard from a peer, but maybe just that or a combination of lack of images. So now I'm like, okay, you're having all the toys, you know, DC superhero girls all across the room. So I want my kids to see all options and representations. So, yeah.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. That does it for us. Did I miss something? Oh,
No,
got your bear. From all of us to all of you, big hugs. And then when I'm done saying big hugs, we'll all say Wakanda
Wakanda
Forever.
Forever. Remember, right over left.
I'm just saying, I got
Right over
ask.
left.
Okay.
Don't
Right
be
over
a
left.
jerk.
Don't get it wrong.
I got
Right.
it wrong. Okay, so here we'll try it once. If it doesn't work, we'll do a couple more takes. So there it is. Thanks for joining us at Wakanda Forever, the psychology of Black Panther. From all of us to all of you, big hugs.
Wakanda Forever.
Forever.
Wakanda forever.
Work.